Video lesson 2.1, Intro to Imperialism. So, just like we kind of talked about in class today with our gallery walk, we're going to go over the textbook definition of imperialism, and then we'll also talk about why countries take over other countries and what they get out of it. So, as our definition of imperialism, imperialism is the act of one country, that should say, asserting political, cultural, or economic control over another group of people or another country. So this usually refers to the expansion of European powers and their conquest and colonization of African and Asian societies. However, in modern times we also use it, some may describe modern American imperialism in the Middle East, for example, because we have some economic or political control over some of those countries in the Middle East, which we'll get to later on in the year. But basically, it's sort of like colonization, like we learned last year. So these European powers, and when we say European powers, we mean Western European powers, they were industrialized, which made them rich, technologically advanced, and very arrogant. They thought, hey, we came up with all of this really great stuff, so we're obviously destined to be better than everyone else, so that gives us the right to take them over. However, we know that this is not actually how societies should be viewed because we have a historical perspective, but this is what Europeans thought in the 19th century. So like I was saying, it is similar to colonialism, how we learned about last year when we talked about how Britain colonized North America, France colonized North America, Spain colonized South America, took over the Aztecs and the Inca. That should all kind of be coming back to you. This is a continuation of that, but because these countries are now industrialized, we call this sort of new imperialism. It's not really new to us, but this is more new than that colonization that was happening in the 16th and 17th centuries. So those who were imperialized by Europeans are known as colonies, and European countries who imperialize are often known as colonial powers or imperial powers. So you might see both of those terms used to describe the European countries. So keep that in mind as we're reading text throughout this unit. So I want to talk about who imperialized who. I'm going to move the screen a little bit so you can see kind of the color coding here. So we see United Kingdom, very tiny country, ends up taking over most of Eastern Africa, India, and kind of this South Central Asia here, including this tip of the Arabian Peninsula, Australia, and some of these little tiny islands down here. But mostly they stay focused on Africa. India was an enormous colony. We're going to get to the details of why Indian and African colonization were different. That's one of the things we're going to learn about in this unit. We're not really going to talk about Australia, but now you might be thinking European type people if you're thinking about an Australian person in your head. But there was actually a huge population of Aboriginal peoples living in Australia at the time. And so these were kind of their native Australians. And they still have a very rich culture that most of Australia is actually a desert. So the Aborigine people have kind of popularized that portion of Australia. But then when the British came over, they obviously have a huge contingency of British people or people of European descent living in Australia today, just like we do in America. They also have Canada. So that was kind of the old colonization. And then we see France mostly has West Africa, so places like Nigeria, Mali, Algeria here, all this portion, this bright blue, that's all France. They also have this tiny little country called Vietnam, and this region up here of Laos, and this region of Cambodia. This is all known as French Indochina, and again we'll talk more in depth about French Indochina at a later date, but I just want you to acknowledge that this area down here, bright blue, is French Indochina. And just as a heads up, I'm going over this for a reason, so we have some context, so this might be a question on your quiz. Once again, we see little tiny Portugal here. Portugal mainly focused on their existing colonies in South Africa, more southern Africa, sub-Saharan Africa here, and they had these colonies for slave trading ports because Portugal was one of the main slave trading countries. Spain, again, also only has a little bit of Africa. The Netherlands, their big swing here in imperialism is this region right here, which we now know as Indonesia, but at this time it was the colonies of the Dutch East Indies, right? Because they thought, remember with Christopher Columbus, these were the West Indies. These are the East Indies. And the United States hanging out over here by itself. We will get to how the United States took over Cuba and over here, the Philippines. They actually won those in the same war. And you'll notice a lot of the countries in Asia are kind of gray and isolated. That's because China kind of closed itself off to protect itself against imperialism, which we'll also get to at a later video. So what motivated these Europeans to imperialize? Just like we saw in our political cartoons today, European powers wanted to imperialize for political reasons, mostly to gain more power on the global stage. And this is a phrase we're going to hear throughout this year. So their leader, whoever that was, for example, Queen Victoria of England, would gain even more subjects around the globe, and therefore the empire would become even more populous and even more powerful. Europeans also wanted to keep Europe the dominant world power, but were also extremely competitive with one another. So it was almost like this sibling rivalry. So this is why I picked this cartoon right here. They're all trying to divvy up China, and Germany and Queen Victoria here are kind of looking at each other like they're really mad at each other. But they are fighting over China, regardless of what China thinks, because as long as one of them gets it, they're all good to go. Economically, Europeans were motivated to imperialize because after industrialism, industrialized powers needed more resources, many of which were not native to Europe or North America. So some examples of these resources are sugar, cotton, rubber, more gold, more coal, more silver, more iron, exotic fruits, vegetables, animals. You saw an image today of the opening of the World's Fair in Britain, and it had those lions and tigers and bears, oh my, and had all those fruits and vegetables. All of these things were wonders of the world to Europeans. They did not know these things, and they thought, because we are so modernized and technologically advanced, we deserve to have these things. In addition to those exotic fruits and vegetables, they needed all of the resources to keep their factories running, and they could also have almost free, basically, labor that they would pay native peoples in their colonies, so people who were colonized by these powers, to harvest those resources for them. So if you're familiar with the movie Hotel Rwanda, that's kind of what I'm talking about here. So they've very much abused the people of the colonies and took advantage of them, exploited them, you may say. Additionally, there's kind of a side twist here of what else motivated Europeans to imperialize. Just like we read about with the white man's burden, there was some cultural motivations for Europeans to take over and set up colonies elsewhere in the world. Again, it comes from this sense of arrogance for having been industrialized first. Europeans and North Americans are the only industrialized countries in the world at this point. So they believe that it is their responsibility or their duty or their burden to civilize the quote-unquote savages, who they saw as savages of the warmer climates, who were not industrialized. So they said, they're never going to figure it out on their own. We should teach them because that is our duty. Look how nice we are by learning to civilize those other people. Of course, I am saying this sarcastically. This is very much not how we should be viewing this today. However, this was the viewpoint of Europeans as they went to these other places that they were unfamiliar with. So those languages that they were not familiar with, the people in Africa and India and Southeast Asia, those parts of the world, they did not have the kind of strict etiquette rules that you had in Victorian London. They just had a different culture, but the Europeans did not see that culture as valid, so they thought it was their duty to enforce their culture on other places through education, through laws, and having only one religion or one language allowed, and forcing that culture, that European culture, on them, on people all over the world, so that everybody could be what they saw as civilized. So they wanted more people to speak their language, more members of their faith, and more people to learn that their country is the right country to stand behind. So, how did this imperialization happen? They took over each region or country by force, often very violently, and often through military force. And as you remember, if they're industrialized, their weaponry is going to be more advanced than a country who is not industrialized. However, their tactics are still very old-fashioned. So a lot of times, this was a very violent, gruesome war that broke out between people who were native to that region and the Europeans that were trying to colonize them. And then they, of course, claimed that territory for their own crown. Remember, all these European countries still have a monarch or a king or a queen, and so we refer to the government as the crown, and you're doing it on behalf of your own country. There is a very passionate nationalism that comes out during imperialism. Then, as we will see next class, they established borders arbitrarily, which is kind of your word of the video lesson, which means very randomly. So they just kind of drew it up, no matter if two existing groups of people were already fighting each other, or whether two existing groups of people were allied with each other, or had connections, or spoke the same language. They kind of just divvied up the land. And kind of how people went along with this, we're going to look a little bit more in depth at the resistance that they were met with. But one of the things that they promised to bring to this new territory, to the new colonies, was infrastructure and other quote-unquote shiny new toys of industrialization. So the roads, bridges, communication, all of that is known as infrastructure. So I want you to write that word down because you're going to see it a lot in our texts. These are all modern conveniences that help a society function as one society. So I picked this one here because you see he is holding a wire. This is actually a telegraph wire, which was invented in our second wave of the Industrial Revolution, kind of concurrently or at the same time as the age of imperialism here. So this man is standing across Africa and holding a telephone line, and he's holding his arms like he's very proud to be doing this for the African people. So the Europeans really did, as we studied in White Man's Burden, feel that it was their responsibility and that they were doing a charitable thing by setting these things up for places like Africa, Southeast Asia, and India. However, part of what we're going to get here in this unit is that this plan that they set up all this stuff actually ends up in the long term hurting those people. So what we're going to start off with next class is kind of the predicted long and short term consequences of imperialism, and then we are going to dive into the actual regions themselves. All right, this is the end of your video lesson. Remember to take your quiz on Canvas.